The first story, The Watcher of Black Pine Woods. A group of 5 old friends, Jake, Ethan, Marcus, Chris, and Liam, gathered for their annual getaway, a tradition they had kept alive for years. This time, Jake proposed an unconventional destination, the Black Pine Woods, a remote and sprawling forest surrounded by ancient legends. Though hesitant, the others agreed, eager to escape the monotony of their lives. They arrived at the edge of the forest just before sunset, the dying light painting the treetops in hues of gold and crimson. The locals at a nearby town warned them not to venture too deep, whispering about an ancient being that demanded solitude. Laughing off the warnings as folklore, they pushed ahead, eager for adventure. The first night passed uneventfully. They set up camp, shared stories by the fire, and drank to their friendship. But as dawn broke, Chris woke everyone with a frantic voice. "Something's wrong," he muttered, holding up a map. The trail they had followed the day before no longer matched the terrain. Trees that should have marked a path were gone, replaced by dense, gnarled trunks stretching endlessly in every direction. "We must have just veered off course," Ethan said, trying to sound reassuring. "We'll figure it out." They packed up and began walking, their GPS losing signal intermittently. Hours turned into a day, and the dense forest seemed to close in tighter. A strange unease settled over the group as they realized the landmarks from the map didn't exist. Even the sun seemed to move unnaturally, casting their shadows in different directions. On the second night, the group stumbled upon a dilapidated cabin deep in the woods. Its walls were covered in strange carvings, spirals, runes, and symbols that none of them could understand. Inside, they found a wooden effigy, a towering figure with antlers for a head and hollow, human-like eyes carved into its face. Marcus stared at it, transfixed. "What, is Tis?" Jake, more daring than wise, picked up a small journal resting near the effigy. Its pages were filled with accounts of sacrifices, rituals, and invocations to something referred to as the Watcher of the Woods. "We should leave," Chris urged, his voice trembling. But the forest seemed to have other plans. That night, Liam woke to the sound of whispers outside the tent. He unzipped it cautiously, peering into the darkness. The whispers grew louder, almost beckoning. Against his better judgment, he stepped into the cold night air. The others awoke to his screams. Rushing out, they found nothing but his flashlight lying on the forest floor, its beam flickering weakly. Liam was gone, his footprints ending abruptly in the soil. Panic set in. They tried to retrace their steps but found themselves walking in circles. Shadows seemed to move in the periphery of their vision, and the air grew heavy with the stench of decay. By the third day, exhaustion and fear began to take their toll. That night, Ethan confessed to hearing voices. "It's like they're calling me by name," he whispered. Jake tried to rally them, insisting they keep moving at dawn. But when morning came, Ethan was gone too, his sleeping bag left behind, its zipper torn apart as if ripped by claws. Desperation turned to paranoia. Jake and Marcus accused each other of hiding something, their once solid friendship unraveling under the weight of fear. Chris tried to mediate but was silenced by a guttural sound that echoed through the forest, a deep, otherworldly growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. They ran blindly, stumbling through the underbrush until they found themselves in a clearing dominated by a massive tree. Hanging from its branches were effigies like the one in the cabin, swaying eerily despite the still air. Beneath the tree stood the figure from the carvings, towering, antlered, and impossibly grotesque. Its hollow eyes seemed to bore into their souls. Marcus froze, his breath hitching. "It's real," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. The creature raised a hand, long and skeletal, and pointed at him. He dropped to his knees, screaming as his body contorted unnaturally. The others watched in horror as he was dragged into the shadows by invisible forces, his screams fading into the distance. Jake and Chris ran until their legs gave out. They collapsed against a fallen tree, gasping for air. "We need to fight it," Jake said, his voice shaking. "Whatever it is, we can't let it take us." But Chris shook his head, eyes wide with terror. "You don't fight something like that. You pray it spares you." The sun began to set again, and the forest seemed to grow darker than it should. They built a small fire, but its light barely seemed to push back the encroaching shadows. As the night deepened, Chris began to hear the whispers again, louder this time. He stood suddenly. "They're calling me." Jake grabbed his arm. "No, it's not real. Fight it." But Chris tore away, running into the forest, his voice crying out, "I'm here. I'm coming." His voice faded, leaving Jake alone. For hours, Jake sat by the fire, clutching a makeshift weapon. The whispers came for him too, but he covered his ears, refusing to listen. When the fire finally died, he felt the presence before he saw it, the towering figure emerging from the darkness, its hollow eyes locking onto him. He screamed, swinging his weapon wildly, but the creature didn't move. Instead, it raised a hand, pointing at him as it had with Marcus. Jake's body froze, his limbs refusing to obey. Slowly, he was lifted into the air, the last thing he saw being those empty, endless eyes. When Jake's body was found weeks later by a search party, it was in the same clearing, tied to the great tree. His face was twisted in terror, his hands clutching a carved symbol on his chest. The locals said nothing, simply shaking their heads as they walked away. The forest remains untouched, its secrets buried beneath its canopy, and deep within, the Watcher waits, patient and eternal. The second story, The Forgotten Village. Daniel loved the solitude of hiking alone. After years of group trips filled with noise and chaos, he craved the quiet that only nature could provide. He planned his route meticulously, a 3-day trek through whispering pines, an untouched stretch of wilderness known for its dense foliage and misty trails. The locals in the nearby town, however, had been less enthusiastic about his plan. "Stay on the main paths," one shopkeeper warned as Daniel stocked up on supplies. "It's easy to lose your way out there, and not everyone who gets lost comes back." Daniel brushed off the warnings, assuming them to be the usual dramatics as small-town folk. By midday on the second day, he realized how wrong he had been. The trail became harder to follow, overgrown with thick roots and shrubs. His map and compass didn't seem to match the terrain anymore, and the sunlight barely pierced the heavy canopy above. He decided to press on, hoping to find a clearing or a landmark. By the time he saw the first signs of civilization, the sun was setting. Through the trees, Daniel spotted a cluster of small, weathered houses. They were arranged in a rough circle around a central square, where a single massive tree stood, its bare branches stretching like skeletal fingers into the sky. Smoke curled lazily from the chimneys, and faint laughter echoed from somewhere within the village. Relief washed over him as he approached, though something about the scene felt off. The houses were old, far older than they should have been. Their wooden walls were blackened and warped, as though they'd endured countless winters. As he entered the village, the laughter abruptly stopped. Faces peered at him from behind curtains and cracked door frames. The villagers, dressed in clothes that seemed centuries out of date, stared at him with wide, unblinking eyes. An elderly woman stepped forward, her gnarled hand clutching a wooden cane. "You're far from where you should be," she said in a voice both stern and trembling. "I got lost on the trail," Daniel explained, raising his hands defensively. "Can you point me in the right direction?" The woman's expression darkened. "There is no direction here. Once you've found us, you cannot leave." Daniel chuckled nervously, thinking it was some kind of local superstition, but the woman didn't smile. Neither did anyone else. The villagers reluctantly offered him a place to stay for the night, pointing him to a small, empty house near the edge of the square. As he settled in, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The whispers started late into the night, soft murmurs just outside his window. When he peered through the glass, he saw nothing but darkness. The next morning, Daniel tried to leave. He retraced his steps back through the forest, but after hours of walking, he found himself back at the village square, standing beneath a massive tree. The villagers watched silently from their doorways, their expressions a mix of pity and fear. The old woman approached him again. "You can't leave," she repeated. "You belong to the forest now." Desperate, Daniel demanded answers. That's when the woman told him the village's dark secret. Centuries ago, the villagers had made a pact with a being they called the Hollow King. The forest was his domain, and he demanded tribute, one soul every full moon. In exchange, the village would remain hidden and untouched by the outside world. But those who stumbled upon it, like Daniel, were considered intruders, and intruders were the perfect offerings. "You don't have to do this," Daniel pleaded. "I'll find my way out. I won't tell anyone about this place." The woman's face softened with regret. "It's not our choice. The Hollow King doesn't forgive. If we don't give him what he wants, he will take all of us." That night, the villagers gathered in the square. They lit torches and circled the tree, chanting in a language Daniel didn't understand. He was dragged to the center, bound at the wrists, and forced to kneel beneath the tree. As the chanting grew louder, the ground beneath him began to tremble. The tree's branches creaked and groaned, twisting unnaturally. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall and skeletal, with hollow pits where its eyes should have been. Antlers jutted from its head, and its bony hands stretched toward Daniel. "No!" he screamed, thrashing against his bonds. "Please, don't do this." The Hollow King crouched before him, its eyeless face inches from his own. Daniel felt his strength leave him, as though the creature were draining the life from his body. Just before the darkness consumed him, he heard the villagers' chant change, their voices trembling with fear. The Hollow King stopped. It tilted its head, as if listening to something unseen. Then, without a sound, it turned and disappeared into the forest. The villagers stared in stunned silence before the old woman approached Daniel, cutting his bonds. "You've been spared," she whispered, her voice trembling, "but it's not over." "What do you mean?" Daniel rasped, his strength barely returning. "You've been marked," she said, pointing to his chest. Daniel looked down to find a strange symbol burned into his skin, one that pulsed faintly with heat. "The Hollow King has claimed you. You may leave, but you'll never truly escape." Terrified and confused, Daniel stumbled away from the village. This time the forest seemed to part for him, and by dawn, he emerged onto the main trail. But the nightmares began that very night. In his dreams, Daniel saw the Hollow King, its hollow eyes watching him from the shadows. He felt the mark on his chest burn whenever he passed through a darkened room or heard the rustle of leaves in the wind. He tried to warn others, but no one believed him. And as the weeks turned into months, Daniel realized the truth. The Hollow King wasn't done with him. It was waiting, patient and eternal, for the day he would return to the forest and complete the pact. The third story, The Hollow Path. A group of friends, Emily, Victor, Lena, and Caleb, planned a weekend camping trip to escape the stress of their daily lives. They chose Blackthorn Forest, a sprawling, remote woodland famous for its unmarked trails and untouched beauty. Though the forest had a reputation for being treacherous, the allure of its mystery was too tempting to resist. The first day passed peacefully. They followed a well-worn trail, laughing and chatting as they set up camp near a small stream. That night, under the stars, Caleb told them about an old legend he'd heard about the forest. "They say there's a path here that's cursed," he began, his voice low and ominous. "The Hollow Path. People who find it never come back. They say the trees on the path are different, covered in carvings that no one can explain. If you see those trees, you're already too late." Emily rolled her eyes, but Lena shivered. "What happens to them?" Caleb shrugged. No one knows, but some say the forest itself doesn't let them leave. Victor laughed, dismissing the story as nonsense, and they all went to sleep. But as the fire died down, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was watching them. The next morning, the group decided to explore deeper into the forest, hoping to find a secluded spot for lunch. Caleb's GPS kept glitching, but Victor, confident in his sense of direction, led the way. The trees grew denser as they walked, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sunlight. That's when they saw the first tree. It was massive, its bark covered in deep carvings of spirals, runes, and crude faces. The lines looked freshly etched, as though someone had just finished carving them. "What the hell?" Lena whispered, running her fingers over the markings. "Looks like someone had too much time on their hands," Victor joked. But as they walked further, they noticed more trees with similar carvings. Each one was more intricate and unsettling than the last. One depicted a series of eyes, wide and staring, while another showed a figure with elongated limbs and a mouth open in a silent scream. "This has to be the hollow path," Caleb said, his voice trembling. "Don't start," Emily snapped. "It's just some weird local art. Let's keep moving." But the deeper they went, the stranger things became. The forest grew unnaturally silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of their footsteps. A faint smell of rot lingered in the air, growing stronger with each step. By late afternoon, they realized they were lost. Every direction looked the same, and the trees seemed to shift when they weren't looking. Caleb's GPS refused to connect, and the sun, which should have been overhead, seemed to hover just above the horizon, casting an eerie golden glow. That night, as they set up camp, they heard whispers. Faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. "Do you hear that?" Lena asked, clutching Caleb's arm. "It's just the wind," Victor said, though his voice betrayed his fear. Emily wasn't so sure. The whispers seemed to come from all around them, weaving through the trees like a living thing. When she turned her flashlight toward the woods, she thought she saw movement, a shadow darting between the trees. The whispers grew louder as the night deepened, forming disjointed words. "Turn back, too late, turn back." None of them slept. By dawn, Lena was gone. Her sleeping bag was empty, her boots and jacket still beside it. There were no signs of a struggle, no footprints leading away, just a single carving on a nearby tree that hadn't been there the night before, a crude depiction of Lena's face, her mouth stretched unnaturally wide. Victor panicked, insisting they search for her, but Caleb refused to move. "She's gone," he said, his voice hollow. "The forest took her." Emily, desperate to stay calm, led them forward, hoping to find the trail back. But as they walked, the trees seemed to close in tighter, the carvings growing more elaborate. Some depicted people in various states of torment, limbs bent at unnatural angles, faces twisted in agony. Others showed a towering figure, its body skeletal and shrouded in shadow, watching from the distance. By the second night, Victor began hearing voices calling his name. "Don't listen to them," Emily warned, but he was already walking into the woods, his flashlight bobbing in the darkness. Caleb and Emily tried to stop him, but he broke into a run, disappearing into the trees. Minutes later, his screams echoed through the forest, cut short by a sickening crack. When they found him, his body was hanging from a tree, suspended by twisted vines. His face, pale and contorted, stared down at them in lifeless terror. Emily and Caleb ran blindly through the forest, their breaths ragged, their hearts pounding. The carvings began to glow faintly, casting an unnatural light on the path ahead. They stumbled into a clearing, dominated by a massive tree whose trunk was covered in faces. Some were familiar. Lena and Victor's faces stared back at them, their expressions frozen in silent screams. "This is it," Caleb whispered. "The hollow path ends here." Before Emily could respond, the ground beneath them began to tremble. The towering figure from the carvings emerged from the shadows, its skeletal frame stretching unnaturally high. Its hollow eyes locked onto them as it raised a bony hand pointing at Caleb. "No!" Emily screamed, but Caleb was already being lifted into the air. Vines wrapped around his limbs, pulling him toward the trees. He cried out in pain. His voice faded as his body was absorbed into the trunk, his face joining the others. Emily fell to her knees, sobbing, the whispers now deafening. The figure loomed over her, but it didn't move to take her. Instead, it pointed to the edge of the clearing where a faint trail glowed in the distance. Terrified but unwilling to waste the chance, Emily ran. The trail led her out of the forest just as the first light of dawn broke the horizon. She returned to town, but no one believed her story. The locals avoided her, muttering about madness and the dangers of Blackthorn Forest. Emily tried to move on, but the carvings haunted her dreams. She could still hear the whispers, faint and distant, calling her back to the hollow path. And deep in the forest, the tree stood waiting, its collection of faces growing with every lost soul.